Somewhere on the African savanna, roughly 2 million years ago, an early hominid was following a herd of grazing animals, the way their entire species had for longer than anyone could remember. And where there are large grazing animals, there is dung, and growing in that dung, scattered across the grasslands, were mushrooms. At some point, someone ate one. Maybe by accident, maybe out of desperation during a lean season, maybe just because it was there and they were hungry and curious in the specific way that kept this species alive long enough to eventually build cities. What happened next is one of the strangest open questions in the story of human evolution. Because today, you live inside a world built almost entirely by accident. Your medicine, your religions, the structure of Western philosophy, the brewery down the street, all of it touched at some foundational point by humans stumbling into a plant, a fungus, or a fermented liquid that changed how their brain worked. Not on purpose, not with any understanding of chemistry or neuroscience. They just ate something or drank something, and it did something to them. And then they kept doing it. This is the story of how that accident happened again and again on every continent in every era, and why some researchers now think it might be one of the most important accidents in the entire history of our species. Here's the part that changes how you should think about this entire question. Humans were not the first species to do this, not even close. Reindeer in Siberia actively seek out psychedelic mushrooms and then stagger around in circles for hours. Elephants will walk absurd distances to find fermented marula fruit specifically because of what it does to them. Wallabies in Tasmania eat opium poppies and hop in circles through poppy fields, to the point that Australian farmers have had to file actual agricultural reports about high wallabies destroying crops. Dolphins, among the most cognitively sophisticated animals on the planet, have been observed deliberately passing around pufferfish, gently chewing them just enough to extract a small dose of neurotoxin, and then floating motionless at the surface in what looks unmistakably like a trance. Researcher Ronald Siegel spent decades documenting this pattern across dozens of species and reached a striking conclusion. The pursuit of altered consciousness might be a fourth basic biological drive, sitting right alongside hunger, thirst, and reproduction. Not a glitch in the system, part of the system. So when that early hominid ate a mushroom growing in a pile of dung 2 million years ago, they weren't doing anything uniquely human. They were doing something that nearly every complex nervous system on Earth seems built to seek out given the chance. What makes humans different isn't that we sought this out, it's what we did with it afterward. Here's the problem with trying to answer when did this start. Drugs barely leave a trace. A plant rots, smoke disappears into the air. A person dies, and within a few centuries there is nothing left but bone, if that. The only way we ever find evidence is by an almost absurd stroke of luck. Residue sealed inside a container, chemical traces preserved in hair kept cold and dry for thousands of years, pollen locked into sediment by geological accident. Which means everything we have found is almost certainly the tip of something much older. The oldest direct evidence anywhere in the world is from Central Asia, dated to roughly 4,600 years ago. Chemical residue from burned cannabis in wooden bowls at burial sites, found alongside a harp at the same location. People burning cannabis, playing music, and mourning the dead while in an altered state. Possibly a more honest funeral than most we hold today. In Spain, on the island of Menorca, a sealed antler-bone tube containing human hair was excavated from a 3,000-year-old cave.
laboratory analysis found traces of ephedrine, atropine, and scopolamine, nightshade-derived compounds capable of producing powerful hallucinations and what ancient accounts describe as out-of-body experiences. The hair showed this wasn't a single event. It happened repeatedly, over at least a year. Someone, probably a ritual specialist, was doing this as a practice, a discipline, possibly a profession. In Mexico, mushroom-shaped stone carvings suggest psilocybin use at least 2,500 years ago, almost certainly older. In the Amazon, ayahuasca, a brew that requires combining two specific, unrelated plants in a precise way to produce its effect, appears in ritual artifacts more than 1,000 years old. Nobody has a satisfying explanation for how anyone figured out that exact combination through trial and error alone. Indigenous traditions say the plants communicated the recipe directly. Science has not produced a more convincing alternative. Every culture that has ever been studied on every continent independently found the psychoactive plant or fungus available in their specific environment, and then built something around it.
Here is the detail that should genuinely stop you for a second. Almost none of this evidence is recreational. It's religious, every single time. The cannabis at Chinese burial sites was for communicating with the dead. The peyote in North America was reserved exclusively for sacred ceremony. The nightshade cocktail in Spain was consumed by someone whose apparent function was mediating between the living and whatever exists after death. And then there's Eleusis. For nearly 2,000 years, one of the most important religious institutions in the ancient Mediterranean world centered on a single annual ritual outside Athens. Thousands of Greek citizens would make the pilgrimage, drink a prepared substance called the kykeon, and undergo an experience that initiates across centuries described in strikingly identical terms. The dissolution of the self, an encounter with the dead, a sense that what they were perceiving was more real than ordinary waking life. Describing what actually happened inside the ritual was punishable by death. Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Marcus Aurelius, among the most consequential minds in the history of Western thought, all initiates at Eleusis. In 2020, researchers analyzed residue from a drinking vessel at an ancient Greek site in Spain and found ergot, a fungus containing chemical precursors to LSD, which means the philosophical foundation of an entire civilization was, in part, built inside an altered state of consciousness, not as metaphor, as a chemical finding recovered from a cup. The pattern repeats with such consistency across cultures that never made contact with each other, never traded a single idea, that some anthropologists now wonder whether psychedelic experience might be the actual origin point of the concept of another world, not the metaphor for it, the source of it. There is a hypothesis, controversial enough that bringing it up at the wrong conference can end a conversation, that goes even further than religion. It's called the Stoned Ape Hypothesis, proposed by ethnobotanist Terence McKenna in 1992. The argument, those early hominids eating mushrooms out of dung on the savanna weren't just having a strange afternoon. Repeated exposure to psilocybin across enough generations may have measurably accelerated human brain development, sharper pattern recognition, increased associative thinking, deeper social bonding, possibly even contributing to the emergence of language itself. Most evolutionary biologists reject the specific mechanism. You cannot inherit a drug experience genetically. The fossil evidence isn't there. It remains, formally, a hypothesis and not a supported theory. But it hasn't fully gone away either.
Psilocybin is a documented psychoplastogen. It measurably promotes new neural connections and increased cognitive flexibility, effects that are real and reproducible in labs today. Mycologist Paul Stamets, one of the most respected researchers in the field, has said publicly that he finds the broader idea compelling, even if McKenna's specific version goes too far. Which brings us to where modern medicine actually stands right now. Psilocybin is producing measurable, lasting improvements for people with treatment-resistant depression. MDMA-assisted therapy is showing results for PTSD that nothing else has matched. We spent the better part of a century calling this superstition, and we are now spending billions of dollars in laboratories, arriving carefully back to conclusions a Bronze Age shaman in a Spanish cave may have already understood. So when did ancient humans start taking drugs? Almost certainly before we have any evidence of it, possibly before our species had a name for itself. Every decade, the timeline pushes further back because the practice is older than our ability to detect it. What survives across every culture we've ever studied is the same conclusion arrived at independently over and over again by people who never spoke to each other. These substances were never just useful, they were sacred.